Hi, I'm Rachel. 3 years in a row, I was the top seller at Whitfield Industrial Supply, and the day they finally filled the sales director position, they handed it to the chairman's son instead of me. Not because he closed more deals, he didn't, not even close. Not because clients trusted him more, they trusted me, and only me with contracts worth millions. He got the title because his last name was Whitfield, and mine was just Cole. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I sat with it for a long time before I understood exactly what it was going to cost me and what it was eventually going to cost them. Here's the part that still gets me. I found out about the promotion the same way everyone else did, in a company-wide email sent on a Friday afternoon. 3 lines long, congratulating Stephen Whitfield on his new role as Vice President of Commercial Sales. No one had told me first. No one had even asked me how I felt about it. Have you ever worked yourself to the bone for something, watched someone else get handed it without even breaking a sweat, and then had to smile and say congratulations in the break room like nothing happened? If that sounds familiar, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It's completely free, and it's the only thing that helps a channel like this keep telling stories like mine. Then stay with me, because what happened 3 years later is the part nobody in that building saw coming. I'd worked at Whitfield Industrial Supply for almost 9 years by then. It's a mechanical and HVAC distribution company based in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of business most people drive past every day without knowing it exists. But if you've ever been in a hospital, a hotel, or a university building in the Carolinas, there's a good chance the heating and cooling systems keeping that place running came through a contract with us. The company was founded by Gary Whitfield's father back in the 70s, and Gary had run it as chairman of the board for over 20 years. It was, in every sense that mattered inside those walls, a family business, and I was never going to be family. That was the wound underneath everything, if I'm honest with you. I was good at my job, better than good. But no matter how many quarters I led the board in closings, I was always going to be the outside hire, the woman from the sales floor who worked her way up, not someone who belonged in the room where decisions actually got made. Gary would shake my hand at the holiday party and tell me I was a credit to the company, and I'd smile and say thank you, and somewhere underneath that smile I'd think, a credit to the company is not the same thing as part of it. I just didn't know yet how literally that sentence was going to play out. I started as an entry-level account coordinator at 24. Answering phones and processing purchase orders for guys twice my age who barely looked up from their desks. I worked my way into outside sales within 2 years, and by the time I was 29, I had the biggest territory in the company, covering half of North and South Carolina, plus a growing slice of Virginia. I didn't get there by being liked. I got there by outworking everyone in that building, showing up to job sites before sunrise, learning the mechanical specs better than half our own engineers, and building relationships with facility directors who wouldn't take a meeting with anyone else at Whitfield except me. By the time I turned 30, I'd landed our single largest client relationship in company history, a regional hospital network called Meridian Health Systems, headquartered 2 hours away in Richmond, Virginia, and expanding fast across 5 states. The first contract I closed with them was worth $4.2 million in the initial year alone, covering mechanical systems for 2 new hospital campuses. Over the following 3 years, I grew that relationship into an $11 million multi-year account, the kind of number that gets read out loud at the annual shareholder meeting while everyone in the room claps for the company. And almost nobody claps for the person who actually built it. Stephen Whitfield joined the company the same year I made regional sales lead, fresh off finishing his business degree, and he came in already carrying a title. Senior account manager, a rank most of us spent 6 or 7 years earning through actual results. He was likable enough in a boardroom, good at small talk with clients over steak dinners, comfortable in a suit in a way that read as confidence even when the numbers behind him told a very different story. His territory quietly underperformed every single year he ran it, but somehow that never seemed to follow him the way it would have followed anyone else in that building, including me. The first time I noticed it clearly, really noticed it, was at a regional sales dinner where the company handed out an award for top new business generated that year. I'd brought in 3 new accounts worth a combined $900,000. Stephen had brought in one small maintenance contract worth about 60,000. They gave the award to Stephen anyway, framed as recognition for, quote, exceptional client relationship building, and I remember sitting there in my chair, clapping along with everyone else, doing the math in my head, and quietly starting to keep my own records of every number that actually belonged to me. I had no idea yet how much that habit was going to matter. I want to paint you a small picture because I think it explains more than any org chart ever could. Gary and his wife lived in Myers Park, the old money neighborhood in Charlotte with the wide oak canopies and the houses set so far back from the street you can barely see the front door, and Gary drove a Mercedes S-Class that the company technically owned, but that nobody ever called a company car out loud. I lived in a one-bedroom bungalow in Plaza Midwood, a neighborhood full of teachers and nurses and people like me with a 15-year-old Honda Accord in the driveway that I was still making payments on the year I closed the biggest deal in company history. Nobody ever said the quiet part out loud, that some of us worked for a paycheck and some of us worked from a family, but you could feel it in every holiday party, every seating chart, every casual comment about somebody's weekend at the lake house. It started small, the way these things always do. A client called Stephen sat in on, just to observe, he said, that somehow turned into his name being added to the account notes as a secondary contact. A report I wrote up after closing a deal that got forwarded to the board under a subject line crediting, quote, the commercial sales team, with Stephen's name listed first because he was technically his father's direct report and I wasn't. None of it was a single dramatic moment. It was more like water finding its way under a door, a little bit at a time, until one day you look down and the floor is wet and you can't remember exactly when it started. I told myself it didn't matter, that the numbers spoke for themselves, that eventually leadership would see what was obviously true to every client and every colleague on the sales floor. I trained Stephen personally that first year, walked him through how to read a mechanical spec sheet, how to talk to a hospital facilities director without sounding like he was reading from a script. I did it because Gary asked me to, and because at the time I still believed that helping the company, helping the family that ran it, was the same thing as helping myself. I would learn, slowly and then all at once, exactly how wrong that belief was. The sales director position had been open for almost a year before they finally filled it, ever since our old director retired to Florida with a pension and a fishing boat. Everyone on the floor assumed it was mine to lose. I had the numbers, I had the client relationships. I had 3 consecutive years as top seller printed right there on the annual report for anyone to check. Ashley Pierce, who sat 2 desks down from me and had become the closest thing I had to a work best friend, used to joke that they'd have to invent a new title just to keep me from taking the old one, because on paper there was genuinely no one else in the running. I laughed along with her. I actually believed it too. When the decision finally came, it didn't come from Gary himself. It came from Lauren Hayes, our VP of Human Resources, who called me into a small conference room on a Tuesday morning, closed the door gently, and told me, in a tone reserved for delivering bad medical news, that the board had decided to promote Stephen Whitfield to Vice President of Commercial Sales. She said it was a, quote, natural progression given his growth trajectory and the leadership's confidence in the family's long-term vision for the company. She thanked me for my contributions. She told me my time would come. I remember nodding, saying something professional and hollow, and then walking straight to the parking garage and sitting in my car for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Your time will come. I want you to notice how that phrase works because I've thought about it more times than I can count since then. It sounds patient. It sounds like a promise. What it actually means, in almost every case I've ever seen or heard about since, is not yet and maybe never, and we needed a nicer way to say it to your face. If you've ever been told to wait your turn while somebody less qualified walked straight past you into the job you earned, I think you already know exactly what the car ride home felt like. And if this story is starting to feel personal to you already, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button because it costs nothing, and it's the reason I get to keep telling stories like this one to people who need to hear them. What almost nobody outside that sales floor understood was what happened in the months right after the announcement. Stephen was now technically my superior, but he still didn't know how to run a hospital account, price a multi-building mechanical retrofit, or handle an angry facilities director at 2 in the morning when a chiller went down in July, so I kept doing it. I kept training him because the accounts were mine to protect whether or not my name was on the door, and because walking away from a client relationship I'd spent years building felt, at the time, like abandoning something that was actually mine. I told myself I was being professional. Looking back, I think I was still hoping someone would notice and correct the mistake. I ceded him 2 of my smaller accounts that spring at his father's request, framed as an opportunity for Stephen to, quote, build his own book of business under my mentorship. I wrote the transition memos myself. I sat in on his first calls with those clients to make sure nothing fell through the cracks, because I still cared more about the clients not getting burned than I cared about protecting my own territory. Every quarter, when the regional performance reports went out, I noticed my numbers on Meridian and 2 other major accounts got quietly folded into a combined commercial sales total that Stephen presented to the board as his division's results, even though every dollar of it traced back to relationships I had built alone, one job site visit at a time. I started keeping better records after that, not out of some grand strategic plan, just out of a habit I'd built years earlier without even realizing how important it would become. Every signed contract, I kept my own copy, separate from the shared drive. Every email where a client thanked me by name for handling something personally, I saved to a folder labeled Simply Documentation, sitting quietly on my desktop where nobody else ever looked. I wasn't building a case against anyone yet. I was just a woman who had learned, slowly, that in that building, if you didn't keep your own record of your own work, somebody else would eventually rewrite it for you. There was a call that spring with a hospital system in Columbia, South Carolina, a smaller prospective client I'd been courting for months, where Stephen asked to join at the last minute, quote, just to observe how a pitch like this comes together. 20 minutes into the call, without any warning, he started answering the client's technical questions himself, confidently and incorrectly, describing a mechanical specification that would have failed inspection outright. I had to step back in, gently correct the record without embarrassing him in front of the client, and steer the conversation back to solid ground, all while smiling like nothing uncomfortable had just happened. We won that contract in the end, on the strength of my correction, and the internal recap email afterwards still thanked, quote, Stephen's leadership on the call. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage after that one too, which was becoming something of a pattern of its own, and thinking very clearly that I was no longer just training him on accounts. I was actively protecting the company from his mistakes, while he collected the credit for my corrections. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being someone's safety net and their scapegoat at the exact same time, and I don't think I had a name for that feeling yet, not until much later. Sitting across the table from Megan with a glass of wine, trying to explain why I felt so tired all the time despite loving the actual work. Ashley started noticing the pattern before I let myself admit it out loud. She'd corner me by the coffee machine and ask quietly whether I'd actually read the last board summary, whether I'd noticed how many times the word reappeared where it used to say my name. I brushed her off more than once, told her I didn't want to be the difficult woman who made a fuss over credit because I'd watched other women at that company get labeled that way for far less than what I was living through. I think that's its own kind of injustice, the way you learn to police your own reactions before anyone else even has to. That same spring, bonus season came around and I found out, through a payroll mistake that briefly showed the wrong numbers on a shared spreadsheet before someone quickly fixed the permissions, that Stephen's base salary alone was almost $40,000 higher than mine, even though my commission and bonus structure that year, tied entirely to actual closed revenue, had paid out more than his total compensation combined. When I asked Lauren about it, carefully, professionally, in a follow-up meeting I requested myself, she told me base salary reflected, quote, scope of leadership responsibility rather than transactional output, and that my compensation structure was, quote, actually quite generous for an individual contributor role. I remember driving home that night, doing math in my head I already knew the answer to, just to feel the shape of it one more time. I didn't tell my mother about most of this while it was happening because she had raised me on her own, working 2 jobs in Gastonia. And I didn't want her to worry, or worse, to feel like the sacrifices she'd made sending me to college had somehow led me to a dead end. But I did tell her about the bonus discrepancy on a Sunday phone call, half joking, half not, and she went quiet for a second before she said, "Baby, they didn't hire you to be family. They hired you to make them money. Don't you ever get those two things confused again?" I laughed it off at the time. I think about that sentence more than almost anything else she's ever said to me. By the second year of Stephen's promotion, the pattern had a rhythm to it that almost felt normal, which is the most dangerous thing a pattern can become. He'd sit in the client meetings I set up, nod along while I did the technical talking, and then follow up afterward with an email to Gary summarizing, quote, his approach to the account. I closed a $2.3 million expansion with a hotel chain that spring, the largest single deal outside Meridian in company history at that point, and the internal announcement credited, quote, the leadership of the commercial sales division under Stephen Whitfield, with my name buried in a single line as, quote, key contributor. I read that email 4 times, sitting alone at my desk after everyone else had gone home for the day. That was around the time I started meeting my college friend Megan Ward for dinner more often than I used to. Megan had gone on to become an employment attorney in Charlotte, the kind of person who could listen to a workplace story and immediately tell you which parts were normal office politics and which parts were something closer to a pattern worth watching. I didn't go to her that first dinner looking for legal advice. I just needed someone outside the building to tell me I wasn't imagining things. She listened to the whole story, the credited emails, the folded numbers, the promotion that skipped me entirely, and she got quiet for a second before she said, "Keep everything, Rachel, every contract, every email, every thank you note a client ever sent you by name. You may never need it, but if you ever do, you will be glad you have it." I didn't fully understand yet why that advice mattered so much, not until much later. At the time, I just took it as reassurance from a friend who happened to know contract law, and I kept doing what I'd already been doing, quietly, without telling anyone at the office. What I didn't realize was that Megan had seen this exact shape of story more times than she could count in her career. Family businesses where loyalty gets confused with blood, and where the people who actually keep the lights on are treated as replaceable precisely because they're not named on the building. Meanwhile, Meridian Health Systems was preparing to open 2 more hospital campuses across Virginia and Tennessee, and their procurement director, a sharp, no-nonsense man named David Reyes, had made it clear in every single conversation that he wanted me handling the expansion personally. David had worked with me for 4 years by then. He knew my direct cell number by heart. He'd told me more than once, half joking and half not, that he trusted Whitfield Industrial Supply because he trusted me, and that if I ever left the company, he'd want to know where I was headed next. I laughed it off every time he said it. I had no idea how much that offhand comment was going to matter 3 years down the road. Stephen, meanwhile, had started showing up to the office with a new watch that fall, a Rolex Submariner his father had apparently given him for turning 35, and he wore it the way some people wear a badge, resting his wrist just a little too visibly on the conference table during client calls he barely contributed to. I don't say that to sound bitter about a piece of jewelry. I say it because it was such a perfect small symbol of the entire arrangement, a reward for existing inside a certain bloodline, sitting a few inches away from a stack of my own call logs and my own signed contracts that had actually paid for it, one commission check at a time, whether anyone in that room wanted to admit that or not. I remember one particular Tuesday that October, sitting in David Reyes's office in Richmond, going over site plans for the new hospital wing, when David looked up at me out of nowhere and asked, half joking, whether Whitfield Industrial Supply even knew what they had in me. I laughed and changed the subject the way you do when a question gets a little too close to a feeling you're not ready to look at directly. But I drove the 2 hours home that night replaying it, and somewhere around the South Carolina line, I let myself admit quietly, just to myself, that I no longer fully believed the company did know or even particularly cared to find out. The expansion contract we were negotiating that year was worth just under $7 million over its first 18 months, the single largest deal Whitfield Industrial Supply had ever pursued with a single client. And everyone in the building knew it was going to be the centerpiece of the annual board meeting that December. Gary himself started sitting in on my client calls that fall, which had never happened before in 9 years, always polite, always complimentary about my rapport with David, and always I began to notice, careful to mention Stephen's name in the same sentence as the deal, even though Stephen had never once spoken to David Reyes directly. I brought this up to Ashley over lunch one Thursday, and she said something that stuck with me for a long time afterward. She said, "Rachel, they're not confused about who's doing the work. They know exactly whose work it is. That's not the problem you're trying to solve." I didn't want to believe her. I wanted to believe that if I just worked hard enough, closed enough deals, made the numbers undeniable enough, the truth would eventually correct itself on its own without me having to make any noise about it at all. I think a lot of people hold on to that belief longer than they should because the alternative feels like admitting the game was never fair to begin with. I called Megan that same week just to talk, and she asked me a question that I kept turning over for days afterward. She asked whether I had ever actually seen, in writing, anywhere, a real plan for my own advancement at that company. A development track, a stated timeline, anything beyond a vague, comforting phrase repeated at review time. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, running back through 9 years of conversations, and I realized I couldn't point to a single concrete document. Just years of verbal reassurance delivered warmly, meaning less each time I heard it, like a check I kept being told was in the mail. That fall, the leaves turned early across Charlotte, and I remember driving out to a job site in Concord on a Saturday morning, alone, because a chiller had gone down at one of our client hospitals and nobody else was answering their phone. I fixed the immediate crisis myself, coordinated with the manufacturer, and had the facility back to full capacity before the Monday shift change, all without a single person from leadership even knowing there had been an emergency. I sat in my car afterward in the hospital parking lot at 6 in the morning and felt for the first time something closer to clarity than anger. I was the actual infrastructure holding these relationships together, quietly, invisibly, and infrastructure like that eventually gets noticed one way or another. There was a smaller moment that fall that told me everything I needed to know if I'd been willing to listen to it at the time. Stephen asked me casually over coffee in the break room whether I'd be willing to, quote, formally transfer primary contact status on the Meridian account to him ahead of the December board meeting, so that, quote, the transition would look clean going into next year. He framed it as a formality, nothing that would change how things actually worked day to day. I told him I'd think about it. I never signed anything. I didn't fully understand yet why some instinct in me refused to put my name on that piece of paper, but I trusted that instinct completely, and it turned out to be the single most important decision I made in that entire chapter of my life. By late November, the pressure in the building had a different texture to it than any year before. Everyone could feel the December board meeting coming, the year-end numbers, the shareholder presentation, the moment when Gary Whitfield would stand in front of the family, the investors, and half the leadership team and tell them exactly how good a year it had been. I worked longer hours that month than I had in years, finalizing every detail of the Meridian expansion, double-checking every clause, saving every version of every document, because some part of me, quieter than logic, was already preparing for something I couldn't yet name. The board meeting happened on the second Thursday of December in the top-floor conference room at Whitfield headquarters, the one with the wall of windows looking out over the Charlotte skyline, the one none of us on the sales floor ever got invited into except on the one day a year we were allowed to present our numbers. I'd worn a plain navy suit and brought a folder with every figure organized down to the decimal because I'd been asked weeks earlier to walk the board through the details of the Meridian expansion myself, since I was, in Lauren's words, quote, closest to the account. I remember feeling something almost like hope walking into that room, which, in hindsight, is the part that still stings the most. Stephen opened the presentation instead of me. He stood at the head of the table in a suit that fit a little too well, a Rolex his father had given him for his last birthday, catching the light every time he gestured at the screen. And he walked the board through the Meridian expansion as though he had personally built the relationship with David Reyes over 4 years of early morning phone calls and emergency site visits. He used words like our strategy, our approach, our win, and he thanked, quote, the broader commercial sales team for their support in making it happen. My name appeared once on a single slide in a bullet point that read, Account Support R. Cole. I sat there in that chair and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold at the same time. I raised my hand quietly, professionally, and asked if I could add some context on the technical scope of the retrofit, since I'd written every specification in that proposal myself. Gary looked at me, said, Thank you, Rachel, we're on a tight schedule today, and moved the meeting straight into the next agenda item without missing a beat. 14 people sat in that room. Not one of them said a word. I have thought about that silence more times than almost anything else that happened to me that year. The specific silence of a room full of people who know exactly what they just watched happen and choose not to say so out loud. I excused myself to the restroom about 10 minutes later, once the meeting had moved fully past the moment, and I stood in front of the mirror with my hands braced on the edge of the sink until my breathing slowed back down to something normal. I remember looking at my own reflection and thinking very plainly that I had spent 3 years being told my time would come, and I had just watched in real time exactly what that promise actually meant when it finally arrived. Not advancement, not recognition. A single bullet point, 3 words long, on a slide somebody else built out of my own numbers. I thought about every performance review where a manager had written in careful corporate language that my potential was, quote, still developing, even in years when my results outpaced every other territory in the company combined. And I understood, finally, that developing had never meant what I thought it meant. It had meant simply not yet ready to be treated as equal. A sentence that could apparently stretch out for 9 years without ever actually arriving anywhere. Megan's office called me 2 days after that board meeting, not Megan herself, just her assistant confirming an appointment I didn't remember making, and it turned out Megan had gone ahead and blocked time on her calendar the moment I texted her that night because she said she knew from the tone of a single text message, Pesia, exactly what kind of conversation we were about to have. When I sat down across from her desk that Thursday, she didn't open with legal strategy. She opened by asking how I was actually doing underneath the calm voice I'd clearly rehearsed on the drive over, and I remember being grateful in a way I hadn't expected, that the first person to hear the whole story wanted to know about the person before she wanted to know about the case. I texted Ashley from that bathroom stall before I'd even fully composed myself. Just 4 words. They gave him everything, and she wrote back almost instantly. Come find me after. We'll figure out what's next. I splashed water on my face, reapplied what little makeup had survived, and walked back into that conference room for the rest of the meeting with a completely calm expression because I had learned, over 9 years in that building, exactly how to do that, how to keep functioning while something inside you quietly finishes falling apart. If you have ever sat in a room like that, watching your own work get narrated back to you by someone else while the person in charge decides your hand isn't worth calling on, I don't think I need to explain what that does to a person's sense of their own value. That is usually the moment people either explode or shrink or quietly stop planning their exit without telling anyone at all. I want to be honest with you about which one I chose because I think it's the part of this story that matters the most. And if you're still with me here, this is exactly the point where I'd ask you to subscribe. Because staying quiet in that room taught me something I never want another person to have to learn the hard way alone. I didn't say anything else in that meeting. I finished the day at my desk, answered emails like nothing had happened, and drove straight to Megan's office that evening instead of going home. I told her everything, the slide with my name reduced to a footnote, the silence in the room, the 14 people who let it happen without blinking. She didn't tell me to fight it, and she didn't tell me to let it go either. She asked me one question. She asked, do you actually need that job, or do you just need someone in that building to finally admit whose work it's been? I sat with that question longer than I expected to, and somewhere in that silence, I felt something in me settle that had been unsettled for almost 3 years. Megan walked me through exactly what I needed to do next, calmly, like she'd seen this play out 100 times before, because in her line of work she probably had. Keep every signed contract, every email where a client thanked me by name, every performance review that documented my numbers in black and white. Never sign anything that formally transferred a client relationship to someone else, no matter how it was framed, because a formality on paper is never really just a formality. And when I did decide to leave, do it cleanly, professionally, with proper notice, no confrontation, no scene, nothing anyone could later use to make the story about my behavior instead of the decision that led to it. I gave my notice in January, 6 weeks after that board meeting, walking into Gary's office on a Tuesday morning with a typed letter and a calm I didn't fully feel inside. I thanked him for 9 years of opportunity, which was true, and I told him I'd decided to pursue a new direction, which was also true, just not in the way he probably assumed. He seemed almost surprised, asked if there was anything the company could do to change my mind, and offered a modest raise on the spot, the kind of number that would have felt like a fortune to me 9 years earlier, and felt in that moment like exactly the kind of gesture that arrives 4 years too late to mean anything at all. I called my mother that same night, sitting in my car in the parking lot outside a grocery store, because I couldn't wait until I got home to tell someone. I expected her to worry, to ask whether I'd thought this through, whether I had enough saved up, all the practical questions a parent is supposed to ask. Instead, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You finally stopped waiting for them to say it out loud, didn't you?" I hadn't thought about it in exactly those words before that moment, but she was right, and hearing her say it back to me, plainly, without any drama in her voice at all, made the decision feel less like a risk and more like something I'd actually been building toward for a long time, without fully admitting it to myself. Ashley took me to lunch the week I gave notice, at a little diner near the office we used to go to on hard days, and she cried a little into her coffee, not because she thought I was making a mistake, but because she said the sales floor was going to feel different without me in it, less like a place where the work actually mattered to somebody. I told her the truth, that I hoped she'd leave too someday when it was right for her, and that I'd keep her number no matter where either of us ended up. Neither of us knew yet how soon that particular promise was going to come due. I also spent a long evening that same week going through every document Megan had told me to keep for years, laying them out across my kitchen table like some strange archive of my own working life. Signed contracts with my name on every line, thank you emails from facility directors across 5 states, performance reviews where my numbers sat in black and white, undeniable, year after year. I didn't organize any of it to build a legal case, not at that point. I organized it because looking at 9 years of honest work laid out in front of me all at once was the closest thing I had to proof for myself that none of it had been imaginary, a physical, undeniable record of 9 years I had genuinely believed, right up until the very end, would eventually be enough on their own to earn me a real seat at that table. I photographed every page, backed it up in 3 separate places, and packed the originals into a single label box that came with me when I moved out of that office for the last time. I worked my full notice period, trained my replacement thoroughly and professionally, handed over every file that legally belonged to the company, and left on good terms, at least on paper. I never once mentioned Stephen's name in any exit conversation, never raised my voice, never sent an angry email to the wrong distribution list, the way people sometimes do on their way out the door. I packed the last box from my desk on a gray Friday afternoon in late January, drove home to my little bungalow in Plaza Midwood, and sat on my porch for a long time, not celebrating, not grieving exactly either, just feeling the strange, quiet weight of an ending I had chosen for myself instead of one that had been handed to me. 3 years passed after that, and I want to tell you honestly, they were not easy years at first. I spent the first several months building an independent manufacturer's representative practice out of a spare bedroom, cold calling old contacts, rebuilding a client base from nothing, wondering more nights than I'd like to admit whether I'd made a terrible mistake walking away from a stable paycheck for the sake of my own pride. David Reyes called me 2 weeks after I left Whitfield, just to check in, he said, and when I told him I was starting my own practice, he went quiet on the phone for a second, and then said, "Let me know when you're ready, because Meridian's next expansion isn't going anywhere without you at the table." I didn't fully believe him yet. I didn't understand yet what that phone call was actually going to mean. By the end of that first year, David had moved 2 smaller Meridian contracts my way. Nothing close to what I'd handled at Whitfield, but enough to keep the lights on and prove the model could work. By the second year, word had spread quietly among the facilities directors I'd worked with for nearly a decade, the kind of word that spreads not through marketing but through trust built one late-night phone call at a time. My little practice grew into a real firm, 4 employees, a proper office in a converted warehouse near Noda, and a client roster built entirely on relationships I had carried with me, legally and cleanly, because I had never once signed away my right to work with people who chose to work with me. Back at Whitfield Industrial Supply, meanwhile, something very different was happening. Something I only learned about in pieces, first through industry gossip, then through an email from Ashley, who had stayed on at the company and watched it unfold from the inside. Meridian Health Systems quietly declined to renew their full-service contract 18 months after I left, citing in the formal letter David's team sent over a, quote, shift in service consistency and account responsiveness. 2 other major clients I had built over the years followed within the next year, one after another, each one citing some version of the same complaint, a company that no longer felt personally accountable to the people actually using its services. Stephen had never managed to build what I'd built with those clients, because what I'd built was never really about Whitfield Industrial Supply at all. It was built on years of 2 in-the-morning phone calls, remembered birthdays, showing up in person during emergencies instead of sending a junior rep, the kind of trust that gets earned one uncomfortable Saturday at a time and cannot be inherited along with the title. Without that foundation, the accounts didn't just underperform. They collapsed, one after another, until the company's revenue for that fiscal year came in nearly 30% below projections, a number significant enough that the board could no longer explain it away as a temporary market dip. I want to be honest that when Ashley first told me pieces of this, over the phone one evening, I didn't feel triumphant the way you might expect. I felt something quieter and more complicated, a kind of sadness for the version of me who had trained Stephen so patiently, who had genuinely wanted the company to succeed, who had believed for longer than she should have that loyalty gets returned in kind. I sat on my porch that night, the same porch where I'd sat the day I left, and let myself feel all of it at once, the vindication and the grief, without rushing past either one to get to some tidier feeling underneath. Megan, when I told her, was far less conflicted about it than I was. She reminded me gently that she'd told me years earlier to keep every piece of paper precisely, because she'd seen this exact pattern resolve itself before, always slowly, always through the paperwork nobody thought to hide, because nobody imagined they'd ever need to defend against their own daughter, figure turned outsider. She said the truth doesn't usually arrive with fireworks in stories like mine. It arrives quietly in a filing cabinet or a shared drive or an old report somebody digs up thinking it will save them. The board ordered a full internal audit that spring, the kind of review that happens when a family business realizes it can no longer simply trust its own last name to explain a bad year. Independent directors, including a long-time board member named Brian Voss, started asking pointed questions about exactly when the client relationships had started weakening and whose accounts had underperformed, and why. Stephen, backed into a corner and looking for anything that could redirect the conversation away from his own 3 years running the division, apparently remembered an old performance report of mine, one he'd pulled from the shared archive years earlier when he was still learning the accounts under my supervision. According to Ashley, who watched the whole thing happen from a seat at that very table, Stephen presented my old report to the board as evidence that my, quote, sales methodology had created unsustainable dependencies that were always going to collapse eventually, regardless of who ran the division afterward. He meant it as a defense of himself. He handed out printed copies, walked the board through my own numbers, my own notes, my own account summaries, trying to prove that the instability had been baked into the relationships from the very beginning, long before he ever touched them. What that report actually showed, in painstaking dated signed detail, was the opposite of what Stephen intended it to prove. Every dollar of the Meridian expansion traced back to my direct signature. Every emergency call log showed my name, my personal cell number, my after-hours response times. Every client thank you note attached to that file, the ones I had documented for years without any grand plan in mind, showed facilities directors thanking me by name for showing up when it mattered. Brian Voss, reading through page after page in silence, apparently looked up at one point and asked the room a simple question. If these were her relationships all along, then what exactly has this division been running on for the last 3 years? Ashley told me later that somebody actually flipped back to the very first page of that report while Brian was still talking, the summary page with the date stamped in the corner, almost 4 years old by then, and did the arithmetic out loud, comparing the number printed there to the number the company had just posted for the year that had ended. The gap between those two figures was not a rounding error or a soft market. It was the exact size of the relationships that had walked out the door once nobody personally accountable to them was left standing behind the counter. Somebody in that room, according to Ashley, actually laughed, not out of humor, just the particular sound people make when a truth lands so cleanly, it feels almost absurd that it took this long to see it. Nobody in that room had an answer for him. According to Ashley, not Stephen and not Gary either, the silence that followed was, by every account I've heard since, the mirror image of the silence in that same room 3 years earlier, except this time it wasn't covering for someone, it was exposing exactly what had been covered up. Stephen had walked into that meeting trying to protect his own record, and instead he had handed the board the single clearest piece of evidence in his own hands, in his own presentation, of exactly whose work had built the company's most valuable relationships all along. The very instrument he chose to defend himself with was the one that finally told the truth out loud. Gary Whitfield called me himself about a week after that meeting, the first time I'd heard his voice in 3 years. He was careful, measured, clearly a man choosing every word with more thought than he'd ever given the ones he spoke to me across that boardroom table. He said the board had, quote, reviewed some historical materials and wanted to explore whether I'd consider returning in a senior leadership capacity, with a formal title this time, a real seat at the table. A compensation package he described as, quote, reflective of my actual contributions. I let the silence sit on the phone for a moment before I answered him, because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't the one who needed to fill it. I told Gary, calmly and without any anger in my voice at all, that I appreciated the call and that I understood exactly what it had cost him to make it. But I wasn't interested in coming back as an employee, not with a title, not with a corner office, not with any amount of money attached to it, because the thing that had actually been broken 3 years ago was never really about the title in the first place. It was about a room full of people who watched the truth get rewritten right in front of them and said nothing. I told him I wished the company well, and I meant it, because I no longer needed it to fail in order to feel like my 3 years there had mattered. David Reyes called me himself the following week, before I'd even mentioned Gary's offer to anyone outside Megan. Word travels fast in this industry, he said, and he wanted to be the first to make sure I knew that whatever happened at Whitfield, Meridian's entire expansion into Tennessee and Georgia, was going to run through my firm, not through any negotiation with my old employer. That contract alone, once it was signed that summer, was worth more to my small practice than my entire annual salary had ever been at Whitfield Industrial Supply, and it came without a single board meeting where I had to sit quietly and watch someone else take credit for it. 2 of my other former clients reached out that same month, almost as if the news of the Whitfield audit had traveled through the same quiet channels that Ashley described. Both of them told me, in their own way, some version of the same sentence, that they had never really been Whitfield's clients to begin with. They had been mine, and they were relieved to finally have an honest reason to say so out loud instead of quietly declining renewal invitations year after year. By the end of that year, my firm had grown to 7 employees and a client roster that, on paper, looked almost exactly like the territory I used to run at Whitfield, except every name on it had chosen to be there. Ashley left Whitfield Industrial Supply about 4 months after the board meeting where Stephen's report backfired on him, and she came to work for me instead. bringing with her a clarity about that building that I think both of us needed to hear out loud from someone else who had lived it. She told me once, over drinks celebrating our first full year in the new office, that watching Stephen hand the board proof of my own work, thinking it would save him, was the closest thing she'd ever seen to real justice happening inside a company that size, quiet, undramatic, and completely undeniable once it was sitting there in black and white on the table. I ran into Stephen once after all of it, purely by accident, at a regional industry conference in Greenville the following spring. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, just in the way he carried himself. None of the easy confidence he used to wear like the watch on his wrist. He came over and said hello, said he'd heard I was doing well, and then, after an awkward pause, said he was sorry for how things had gone at the board meeting that year, that he hadn't fully understood at the time what he was actually holding when he handed those pages around the table. I told him I appreciated him saying so, shook his hand, and went back to my own booth, where David Reyes was waiting to introduce me to 2 new facility directors from a hospital system in Georgia. I didn't need anything more from that conversation than what it already was, an honest sentence offered once and left where it belonged. In the past, I heard, secondhand and much later, that Stephen stepped back from the vice president role within a year of that audit, moved into a smaller operations position with a lower profile and considerably less authority over client relationships. I never asked for that outcome, and honestly, I didn't need it. I wasn't interested in watching him fall as some kind of trophy, and if anything, some part of me still felt a strange, complicated flicker of sympathy for a man who had spent his entire career being handed things he was never given the chance to actually earn, which is its own quiet kind of unfairness, even if it looks from the outside like nothing but privilege. What I needed, the only thing I ever actually needed, was for the truth of who had built those relationships to exist somewhere other than inside my own head and my own quiet folder of saved emails. And by the time that board meeting was over, it existed in the official record of the company itself, whether they liked it or not. Gary sent me a handwritten letter about 2 months after our phone call, which surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. It wasn't long and it wasn't dramatic. It said, in essence, that the board had come to understand, later than it should have, that the numbers the company built its reputation on for years belonged to specific people doing specific work, not to the family name on the building. He apologized, plainly, for the way that Thursday board meeting had gone 3 years earlier, and for every quiet moment before it that had led me to believe my work needed his son's name attached to matter. I kept that letter. I didn't need it to feel whole, but I kept it anyway in the same folder where I'd once kept every contract with my own signature on it. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters more than the ending most people expect from a story like this. I didn't respond to Gary's letter with warmth, and I didn't respond with bitterness either. I wrote back 3 sentences, thanking him for the acknowledgement, wishing the company continued stability, and politely declining any further conversation about my return. Some boundaries aren't meant to soften over time just because the other person finally says the right words. Mine didn't. I'd spent 3 years building something that was entirely, legally, unquestionably mine, and I wasn't interested in folding it back into a family that had only ever seen me as useful, never as one of their own. If there's a moment near the end of this story I'd want you to actually sit with, it's not the audit and it's not even the letter from Gary. It's a quiet Tuesday morning about 6 months after my firm crossed its first $1 million in annual revenue. Sitting in my own office, in a building with my own name on the lease, taking a call from David Reyes about a new campus opening outside Knoxville. Nobody in that call needed to remind anyone whose relationship it was. Nobody needed a slide with my name reduced to a footnote. If you have ever wondered whether quietly doing the work, documenting it, and waiting for the right moment to let the truth speak for itself actually works, I promise you it does, even when it takes 3 years longer than you wish it had. And if this story reminded you of your own version of that boardroom silence, I hope you'll subscribe and stay, because there are a lot more stories like this one still waiting to be told honestly. Looking back on all of it now, I don't think this was ever really a story about a promotion or a title, or even about Stephen Whitfield specifically. He was just a person who happened to be born into the right last name at the right company, and honestly, some of what he did, he probably did without fully realizing the weight of what it cost someone else. The way people who've never had to fight for a seat at the table rarely notice who's still standing behind it. The real story, the part I actually want you to walk away with, is about what happens when you spend years being told your value is coming later. Someday, eventually, while somebody else gets handed a version of it right now for reasons that have nothing to do with merit at all. I didn't quit my job that January. Not really. I quit waiting for my work to speak for itself because I'd finally understood that some rooms will let good work sit in silence forever if nobody in charge has a reason to say it out loud. So I made sure it finally spoke, not through a scene, not through a lawsuit, not through anything loud or dramatic, but through 3 years of quiet documentation that simply outlasted everyone's ability to pretend otherwise. If you're sitting somewhere right now doing excellent work for people who keep telling you your time is coming, I hope you hear this clearly. Your time doesn't have to come from them. Sometimes you have to build the room yourself and let the truth walk in on its own schedule. I still keep that folder, the one labeled simply documentation, even now, years after I needed it for anything specific. Not out of bitterness and not because I expect to ever need it again. I keep it because it reminds me of a version of myself who kept showing up, kept doing the work honestly, and kept a quiet record of the truth, even when nobody around her seemed to think it mattered yet. It mattered. It always does, eventually, even when eventually takes 3 years longer than you wish it had. If this story felt like your own life at all, whether it was a promotion, a family business, or just a room where your name kept getting left off the credit, I hope you'll take a second to subscribe before you go. It doesn't cost you anything, and it's genuinely the only reason I get to keep sitting down and telling stories like this one for people who need to hear that quiet, patient, documented truth eventually finds its own way into the light. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of mine